Welcome to Feel Good From Within. I'm Yvette Blowitz, your host. Today's guest is Dr. Robert Enright, who is a licensed psychologist, founder of the International Forgiveness Institute. Dr. Robert Enright has been called the Forgiveness Trailblazer by Time magazine and is often introduced as the father of forgiveness research because of his 35 years academic commitment to researching and implementing forgiveness programs. In 2002, he was awarded one of the highest awards, the American Psychological Foundation Gold Medal Award for Impact in Psychology, for his research on forgiveness. In The Forgiving Life, Dr. Robert Enright shares guidance on how to forgive those who have acted unfairly or who have inflicted emotional hurt, along with the benefits of forgiveness and how we can embark on a path of forgiveness and leave behind a legacy of love. I'm really grateful you are choosing to listen to this podcast episode. I hope this conversation allows you to learn, develop, and grow. I'm going to be speaking to Robert Enright today about his book, The Forgiving Life. Dr. Robert Enright, I'd like to welcome you to the podcast show. How are you today?
Thank you, Yvette, for having me. I'm doing quite well.
I'm so grateful you're here with us today and with our global audience. I'm super grateful you're tuning in. Dr. Robert Enright, before we dive into your book, are you happy to tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
I am a professor of educational psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I helped found the International Forgiveness Institute, a nonprofit organization which gives out information and free research scales on forgiveness to anyone in the world. And I started studying forgiveness in 1985 when I got tired of studying the usual moral developmental issues of the day, which basically were how we think about justice and how children think about justice. And I woke up one day and asked myself a very dangerous question: who am I helping with that work? And my answer was nobody. So I asked the reverse of justice. I said, what happens when we're thrown down into the pit of injustice? How do we get out of that? And the idea of forgiveness kept coming up. So I went to the library, because you couldn't do Google back then, and I did a computer search of the literature with the help of the librarian and realized there were no published studies at all on person-to-person forgiving that had ever been in psychology, which had been around for almost 100 years. So I thought, I'm going to start studying this. And I did. We had the first publication ever in 1989 on person-to-person forgiving. And we helped start a field where there are now thousands of researchers studying forgiveness because it matters.
I love that. I love that story, how your pioneering work was born out of asking a question and then going down to the library and then looking for the answers and not finding them and deciding that you would just start that work and research it. And here we are today talking about the forgiving life all these decades on. When it comes to the forgiving life, what inspired you to write this book, and what is the meaning behind the book title?
Well, prior to writing The Forgiving Life, much of the work that we did at the University of Wisconsin-Madison was to help people who were emotionally injured by an injustice from another person. And the one who forgives then focuses on that one person and that one action of injustice. And I thought about Aristotle, who really has been my mentor, even though he was several thousand years before me. He said, well, you don't practice any one moral virtue, such as justice or patience or forgiveness, by just doing it once and it's over. But once you continue to practice that virtue, when you forgive another person and 3 more people, you start to develop what he calls a love of the virtue. And to me, if you start developing a love of the virtue, it becomes part of your identity. It becomes part of who you are as a person. And so I wrote The Forgiving Life to show people how to so practice forgiving and to take it so seriously that they can A, develop a love of it, and B, make it literally a part of who they are. Thus the title, The Forgiving Life.
And when it comes to forgiveness, what is forgiveness?
Forgiveness is a moral virtue, as justice is, and patience and kindness. And it's different from all of the other moral virtues in that it is centered on being treated unjustly by others. And so when you are treated unjustly by others and you want the fullness of forgiveness, you try to get rid of the negative thoughts and feelings and behaviors toward the one who hurt you. And here's where it gets controversial, to offer goodness in terms of how you think about the other, your feelings toward the other, and even your behavior toward the other who has been unfair to you. So it seems a little ridiculous if you think about it. Why would I want to be good to those who are not good to me? Well, that's primarily because you're thinking only about justice. And if you start thinking about the realm of mercy, now you see that there is something more to getting even, or an eye for an eye. Once you start folding mercy into the equation, being good to the other probably isn't such a bad thing.
And in the book, you had a lot of scenarios, examples, and stories throughout the book. One of the themes was there was resentment around a parent who wasn't there for them throughout their childhood. And then they continued to take that resentment, anger, frustration into their next relationship. Can you share how things that happen in our childhood, even though that maybe at the time as a child might not seem as unjust, but we carry it forward into our next relationship, into the next generation?
Yes, I have found, and research really in psychology has found, that when we're treated in certain ways in childhood, we learn those behaviors. And oftentimes when we're wounded by those behaviors, let's say someone speaks harshly to us, there's a tendency to internalize that and then to displace the exact same pattern onto your partner when you're an adult, to your children. And you know what happens to your children? Once they experience that, they grow up and they then pass it on to partner and children, and on it goes, where certain kinds of patterns that are unjust, that are hurtful, literally can be handed down through the generations so that the children's children are reproducing what might have happened 100 years ago, and no one's aware of that. But someone at some point has to stop that cycle of misbehavior, of cruelty, of injustice by forgiving those who have hurt them in the most recent past, which probably would be a parent or a sibling. And then you stop that intergenerational pattern with your own partner or children. So forgiveness can actually stop a freight train of discontent and injustice that knows no end unless we forgive.
That was such a good explanation. And I can see how, when I even reflect over my own life, where a story that was really passed down through my granddad of injustice, and at the time it was with Aboriginal people being displaced or being taken off their land and put in other areas, and that being done by the government. And naturally, as those stories get taken from generation to generation to generation, it causes a lot of mistrust when it comes to the authorities. And that can be a very difficult trait to break. But I have discovered in this journey that until we can forgive those people who are now long gone, they're no longer here on earth, the people that came from Britain and disrupted the First Nations way of life. But until we can find forgiveness, not to disrespect or disregard what happened, we can't really let go of that anger or resentment. And that's tough. I think what's even tougher, Robert, and I love your insight in this, is when it's like people you don't know who did the unjust. It was at the time, say, the government then or the police officers then, separating them. That sometimes can be harder because we carry that now to, say, the current government in place. But there comes a point in time, if we don't forgive, it's always going to be going down generation to generation to generation. And I think that's why I liked your book. I felt it was easier to do the exercise when it was someone you specifically knew who had done the unjust. But what are your thoughts on that when there is that generational stories of unjust or anger or resentment? They felt they were powerless.
I think it's a very important question you ask, Yvette, because what is really going on here is whether we're going to continue with the hatred in our heart or whether we will be cleansed of that. And I work in different areas of the world where there are land disputes, like in the Middle East. There are land disputes between different cultural groups. I work in Northern Ireland, which has a similar kind of issue with Australia between British and Irish, where the British came over the Irish Sea and took land, and the Irish weren't too happy about that. And that was in the 1500s, and guess what? We're now in the 2000s, and they're still not so happy about it. And if you do the math quickly, how many hundreds of years is that? One person in the Middle East who was a leader said to me, I'd like you to come in to talk about this idea of forgiveness because the anger that has built up in our community is actually destroying our own community. He said, we are destroying individuals, families, and our own community because of the toxicity of the anger. Please come in and talk with the different groups about the possibility of forgiving. Well, you know what happened the first time I went in, and the second, and the third, and the 10th? People got very upset with me about the idea of forgiveness because they said, you, Enright, are dangerous. Why am I dangerous? Because you want us to lay down and die and let the other group have the land. You want us to so give in just so we can be healthy. We're going to give away everything. Get out of here. And I say, no, you're misunderstanding what's happening here. When you appropriate forgiveness, you do not throw justice away. In fact, when you are less hate-filled, when you are less angry, maybe the way you ask for justice and the perseverance in asking for justice will be much, much better. See, people tend to think in either or ways about forgiveness and justice. They think you forgive and you give everything away that you've ever worked for and fought for and your ancestors have fought for, or you forget forgiveness and you keep fighting the other person and the other group. No, you can do both. But it's hard, as you say, to forgive those who started land disputes or dealing with displacing First Nation people when you've never seen them and they've been dead for 150 years. But you can begin the process of forgiveness because forgiveness basically is, the core of it is beginning to widen your vision of who those are you have hated. And you strive to see the humanity in the other despite their faults. You start to see the inherent worth, the unconditional worth of others. And, those who've displaced First Nation people had grave errors because they weren't seeing the humanity in those who had the same humanity as those who were having the power. But if we can see that all people have inherent worth. All people, therefore, are special, unique, and irreplaceable, even though they do very bad things. We no longer define them only by the bad things. And therefore, when we sit down at the peace table now with those who still have some of these norms that are not healthy, the way we see them first as human might help us talk to them in a more settled, civil way, where the justice actually might be deeper and better and be achieved more quickly. So even though they wanted to kick me out of the Middle East, it was because of a misunderstanding that they thought forgiveness only. You're here representing the other side. Get out of here. No, justice and forgiveness need to grow up together.
I love that. Justice and forgiveness need to grow up together.
Correct.
Love that message, because I have discovered if you hold on to resentment, anger, hatred, it's not healthy for you. And
Right.
that's where my next question leads into. When we choose not to forgive and hold on to resentment, anger, hatred, what does that actually do to our mental health and well-being?
We have done many studies with incest survivors, men who have cardiac problems, men in a maximum security correctional institution. I worked with a group in Pakistan, and they worked with women who were the victims of acid burn attacks. We worked with divorced people who had very unfair marriages. And in almost all of these cases, when there is trauma because of injustice, not all injustice leads to trauma. If you have let's say, a meeting at noon tomorrow for lunch and someone fails to show up, that's not going to traumatize you. But if someone steals your land or throws acid in your face, or there's incest, you're going to have trauma. And that trauma takes the form first of unhealthy anger that takes root in the heart, hard to get rid of. And that tends to multiply the mental health challenges. It can include anxiety, depression, hopelessness. And you know who people end up not liking when they've been treated terribly unfairly by others? I see this characteristically. They tend to not like themselves. In other words, they almost begin to believe the story that I have been treated badly because maybe I deserved it, or maybe I did something that I shouldn't have done. And there's a tendency to turn the judgment onto yourself. The incest survivors, with whom Suzanne Friedman worked, and we published it together, they did nothing wrong. But when they came to us for help with forgiveness, they did not like themselves. And once they forgave, you know who they ended up liking? Themselves, because they began to see the humanity in the one who led to the trauma, and they then saw the humanity in themselves as well.
That is so fascinating, that research. One question that comes up when I chat to people within my own community, as an example, women who have been treated badly by their husband, whether that's an affair, mistreated, they can't forgive that person. And it can be 10 years down the track, and they're still going over and over and over and not willing to forgive what's happened. A lot of people say, I won't forgive because it was so terrible what happened to me. I'll never forgive that. Beep, 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 beep. And all the words get thrown in. Do we have to, at some point in time, accept what has happened? How does someone who is stuck in this cycle going over the injustice actually move on and start to create a new life if they're always back in the past?
Well, forgiveness definitely is not excusing. If a woman who's been treated terribly unfairly by a husband in a marriage decides to forgive, she will say in a tough-minded way, what happened to me was unfair, is unfair, and it will always be unfair. And I'm not going to try and soften that. My softening is toward who he is as a person. And that doesn't take away from what he did. But when you have mercy on this other person and you begin seeing his woundedness, in all likelihood, when you see this kind of trouble in the marriage, those who are the perpetrators of the injustice oftentimes come into the marriage terribly wounded, perhaps from the family of origin, perhaps from a job, perhaps from something else, and taking it out then on the spouse. And when you see that, you realize, oh, there's more to this person than I thought. There's woundedness inside of his heart. And I'm not excusing, but indeed I'm seeing more of him than I had before. And in fact, these kinds of approaches, these kind of perspectives were used by Gayle, Gayle, Reed, Reed, in a study just like you described, women who've been abused in marriages, and they had very negative views of how the world works. They were suffering from psychological depression. And you see, not only now do they have the abuse from the husband, but now they have all this discontent within themselves. Wouldn't it be better to know you will have to live with what happened and it was unfair, is unfair, and will always be unfair? But now I am cleansed from within, from all that has built up within me. Look at all the power that person still has over you. If all the abuse happened, as you say, 10 years ago, and now a divorce happened 10 years ago, the effects of what happened are still very much alive and living within the person. Let's get rid of that. And if we can get rid of that through forgiveness, that man who was terribly abusive to the woman no longer has that kind of power over her. The power he has over her, she could take to her grave. If she forgives, that power is released and she is healthier. And maybe she can then move on, maybe to other relationships, maybe friendship, or even, just camaraderie with others. It doesn't have to be another marriage. It might be, but it doesn't have to be. And because the trust with others, it can be thwarted when you're crushed with this kind of trauma. And at least now you have a way out. People treat you unfairly, and that way out is forgiveness. Forgive and get your inner world back, and the other's power vanishes.
I love that. Forgive and get your inner world back.
Yes.
One of the things you just said then, which really struck me, was not taking this to the grave.
Yes. Well, we did a work, Mary Hansen, Hansen, and I did a study with women in hospice where they had about 6 months to live, and most were in their 80s. And we screened them for trauma against them where they might want to forgive. And some of the women, when they talked about the injustice against them and they still had the trauma within their heart, that injustice for some of them happened 40 years ago. Think about that. Many of them forgave, and then they would draw the family to their bedside and try to work on forgiving and reconciling. You don't always reconcile when you forgive. That's coming together in mutual trust. If you can't trust, you don't reconcile. But some of them did draw the family to the bedside, and their sense of hope for the future actually increased even though they were dying, because they knew they were going to be leaving the family in a better condition because they had forgiven and reconciled than if that had not occurred. But 40 years ago, Yvette, and it was still in their heart.
Wow, 40 years. And that just reminds me when you talked about Ireland and England, and we can reflect on Australia with the First Nations and Britain. And as the years go by, we do have to find that forgiveness in our heart to get our inner world back.
Exactly. I have found that forgiveness is the most powerful antidote to the effects of trauma that's been induced by the unfairness of other people. And let's face it, this is a very challenging world. Every human being on the planet at some time is going to experience injustices that are serious. It'd be nice to know the antidote to the effects. Forgiveness is that antidote.
Yes, and when I discovered through your work how depression can be a symptom or an illness by not forgiving and holding all that hatred and resentment. And that made me realize how important your work is, the work of the forgiving life and forgiveness, and what an important component is. Because it made me think you could go to, say, the psychiatrist, be taking medication, be exercising, be trying to sleep well, eat well. But then if you haven't got the forgiving life happening and starting to overcome that resentment and choosing to be a path of creating a legacy of love, then I still felt that was a part of the jigsaw puzzle that needed to be put in when it came to mental health, which I think sometimes can be overlooked, can be just about meditation, yoga, medication, eating well, sleeping well.
I think you're absolutely right. And here's why I think it's so difficult. First of all, forgiveness, as we said earlier, was off the radar in psychology until around the 1980s. And also, when people come in for therapy, and let's say they're having trouble with sleep, the focus is on the sleep. But what it seems to be missing oftentimes is there's a cause that might have happened years ago, like the hospice people 40 years ago, and the mental health professional, because the person isn't trained, let's say, in forgiveness therapy, doesn't look back 40 years to what happened then that literally now might be implicated in the sleep challenge. So if we change the way we think about mental health, if someone comes in and complains about a symptom, let's not focus only on the symptom, what might be causing it, not just in a proximate way within the last week or even year, what really might have precipitated this and caused this through deep injustice that induced trauma, and the sleeplessness is part of that trauma from being treated unjustly 40 years ago.
That's such a good example, looking at one's overall story and their trauma, and such an important part, I believe, in the whole mental health space. You talked about in the book agape love.
We have to remember that forgiveness is a moral virtue. All moral virtues deal with goodness, but forgiveness actually has a particular, very powerful moral virtue above it. And it is from agape love that forgiveness in its deepest sense flows. And agape, A-G-A-P-E, it's a Greek term, is one of the four kinds of loves that the ancient Greeks used to discuss. Eros is one, that's romantic love. Storge, S-T-O-R-G-E, is the natural love between a mother and a child, for example. You see these kinds of loves that you don't necessarily see as really, really deep. And the deepest form of love is agape in the sense you want to be good toward others even when it's painful for you to do so. So a mother who's up all night with a sick infant is practicing storge, but she also now is practicing agape because she's exhausted and she has given of herself. And so agape is offering goodness through your pain. And that doesn't mean the person treated you unjustly, such as the infant, for example. What agape is relative to forgiveness is you decide to be good to this other person for the other's sake, to try and build this other person up, to stop the injustices and the like, to help the other maybe grow in humanity. And that is painful to do because you have to enter into this other person's world and thinking about the other and the feeling that you have toward the other person, and maybe even spend time behaviorally if it's safe to do so. And you have to bear the pain of what happened so you don't throw the pain back. And as Mahatma Gandhi said, if you keep taking an eye for an eye, the whole world will be blind. So you stop taking an eye for an eye, and that's painful. And so on its highest level, forgiveness is offering agape love through your own pain without throwing the pain back to the other for the good of that person, hopefully for the good of the relationship.
I love that message. And I think since listening to your book, The Forgiving Life, There was something that happened most recently, and there was young kids and involved in crime, doing all the wrong things. And most people wanted to express anger and hatred and all of those emotions. But I think I was able to have more compassion and not just solely focusing on that criminal act, but kind of wondering, where has this all stemmed from or come from? Can we use this practice of forgiveness even in our day-to-day life, where instead of reacting in an angry way, a hatred way, we can sit back in a way and have more compassion or more understanding, or listen with an open, loving heart?
Yes, and we should start thinking about doing that with people in our own families, in our own social networks, at work, where we deliberately try to cultivate a wider angle lens in viewing who this person is. And sometimes that's hard, such as youth who commit serious crime. As I had mentioned earlier, recently finished a forgiveness intervention in a maximum security correctional institution where we interviewed over 100 men. Over 90% of them, 90%, had serious injustices against them in childhood or adolescence. 40% of them never told anyone about it, and they were opening up because we asked. That does not excuse their behavior. If their behavior is dangerous, they should be in a correctional institution. I'm not saying open the door because they've been wounded at age 6. But I am saying when they wound others, we need to see their own woundedness, out of which came their crime, and give them a chance to forgive those who brutalized them in childhood. Do you think that would make rehabilitation in prison safer? I think it would. But if you have regular rehabilitation and they're still fuming with hatred, it's not going to work. So our traditional way of working with those who are incarcerated has yet to add the dimension of asking the question, are some of these people wounded, gravely wounded, and can we heal the effects of that trauma so they can go ahead with the traditional kind of rehabilitation? Now, let's fast forward to 6-year-olds who have not committed crime yet. Wouldn't it be better if parents and children, in the safety of their own home, deliberately tried to cultivate forgiving so that some of these wounds are avoided? Some of the effects of wounds, when they happen, don't build up to hatred. So the everyday people who are just walking around the streets of any city in the US or Australia can come home and practice forgiving and make forgiveness part of a forgiving life, and make forgiveness part of a family life and a corporate life and a house of worship life, so that we forgive in all of our different communities. The world would be much better off.
I love that message, and it's remarkable that you went into the maximum security, because there are some people who wouldn't even want to go there because they wouldn't want to be even helping people who are incarcerated. So it's a good credit to you with the forgiving life, that you can see the person beyond, and you said it earlier, from a wider lens. You mentioned that every individual, every human has worth beyond that criminal act or injustice that they have committed. I want to ask you, in your book, you mentioned qualia. What does that mean?
Qualia is a philosophical term of the reality within a person, the subjective experiences of a person that are very, very real and can indeed show people that forgiveness operates within and then flows out with regard to observable behavior in terms of what is spoken or what is done. The idea of qualia is to look within one's own self within the subjective nature of thinking and feeling, and examine that and be aware of how when you are forgiving, the heart starts to soften. See, that can be an encouragement. Hey, my heart was stony cold toward this person, and I'm sensing this softening. It's not necessarily complete, but it's better than it was. I want to stay on this journey. And then you continue practicing it, and then maybe practicing with other people. And that's when you develop interiorly the love of the virtue. That's part of the qualia, the inner love of the virtue, which helps forgiveness literally become a part of your own identity. And that's when you feel almost a sense of obligation to yourself to appropriate forgiveness whenever you've been treated unjustly. It becomes part of your lifestyle. And you then not only are feeling better yourself, but you become a gift to other people because your discontent doesn't spill over to them. In your forgiving, you become a gift to others in your family, your circle of friends, and others.
That's a beautiful message. You become a gift. In your book, you did say, wounded people wound people.
Yes.
And how important the forgiving life is, and how it's just not a one-off. And you mentioned that then it's a continual practice or way of life. And I think leaving the legacy of love was such a beautiful message. And it reminded me of, do you want to be known as someone who's hateful, with resentment, hatred, or one who has a kind, loving, compassionate, forgiving heart? And the two are very different in emotions. What if someone who's listening in has done something that they're embarrassed about, that they are having a difficult time forgiving themselves, but there's been a situation when they haven't been their best self and it's hurt someone else or hurt themselves? Does the person also have to forgive themselves?
Yes. See, we can have moral virtues toward ourselves. Aren't we fair with ourselves, where we give ourselves adequate nutrition and rest? Aren't we patient with ourselves as a moral virtue sometimes when we're trying to learn something new? We apply the moral virtues to ourselves. So why can't we then apply forgiveness to ourselves? And what would that be? You do not define yourself by that unjust action that hurt other people and hurt yourself. You try to widen the lens toward yourself. You see that you too are a person of worth. You have mercy on yourself, but at the same time, here's where self-forgiveness differs from forgiving others. When you self-forgive and you have acted unjustly in some way, you usually hurt others as well as yourself. So you want to go to those others and seek forgiveness. And be patient, because their forgiving you is their call, and that can take time. So self-forgiveness oftentimes is harder than forgiving others because we tend to be harder on ourselves than we are on others. So we have to have the virtue of patience when we do this. And I usually recommend people forgive someone else first if they've never really walked the path of forgiveness. Forgive another person because it's easier. Then you know that pathway where you see their woundedness. You see that they have inherent worth. You bear the pain. You're aware of the softened heart. You try to be good to the other in some way, a smile, a return phone call, a kind word about that person. But then you apply that to yourself. You start seeing yourself as human. You bear the pain where you don't abuse yourself, and you're good to yourself, and seek forgiveness from others. And then you can complete that issue. And again, if people have a transcendent or religious perspective, seek forgiveness from God, if indeed a person sees sin in there.
I love that message. Seek forgiveness from God if you see sin in there. In your book, you actually included an exercise where you choose one person and then you work through a series of questions. You do scores. And so for our listeners tuning in, the Forgiving Life, you actually have the ability in there to start the Forgiving Life journey. Was your thinking behind that so you could actually help people work through the actual process?
Yes. And the larger exercise where you have an exercise of walking a pathway of forgiveness with one person, I have a larger one we call the forgiveness landscape. And in the forgiveness landscape, I ask people to make a list of all the people you can think of now who have ever been unfair to you or you're disquieted by it even now. And you make a list from when you're a young child all the way up to now. So it could be a football coach when you were 16. You almost forgot about that, but you have resentment toward the football coach. You put that down. Or mother who disrespected me in front of my friends when I was 10, write that down. My boss yesterday who was insensitive, write that down. Then on a 1 to 10 scale of anger, how angry are you now toward this person for this series of events or one event? And then you order these people from those with whom you have some anger, but it's like a 4 on a 1 to 10 scale, all the way up to those who are a 10, who really are disquieting you. And you work through the forgiveness exercises with those lower on the list, and you do that all the way up to the very top, and you literally can cleanse yourself of the effects of injustice against you from everyone in your entire life, from when you were 5, if you can remember back that far, all the way to the present. And it's a way of cleansing that truly might help one say, life is worth living, man.
I love that. Life is worth living, man. I was sitting there thinking how everyone who is on Mother Earth right at this minute and many generations to come, how important your work is. Also, your colleagues and everyone else you work with, all of the researchers, and also the people who are taking part in your forgiveness research and work that you do. But I do believe that forgiveness will be the key. The Forgiving Life will be the key to feel better from within and to create a healthier community, family, environment, and country and nations in the world. It's so important. And I think that's why I love stumbling across your work, because I believe as much as I love to exercise and eat well and do all of those things, if I still have hatred in my heart or resentment, that's only going to affect my mental health and well-being. So for anyone listening in, be sure to grab a copy of The Forgiving Life from any good bookstore or on audio. And Robert, you give a lot, you travel a lot, you're always on a mission to help other people. How do you take care of yourself, and what are some of your self-care rituals?
Well, self-care rituals are spending high quality time with my dear wife. I am an avid physical fitness person, where before you and I talked today, I went on an 1.5 hour hard bike ride. I lift weights, I do push-ups and sit-ups, and I really take this idea seriously and just try to kick back or relax sometimes and not always be doing the work, because you have to put it in balance, to what Aristotle called temperance, where you don't work at it all the time, you put it into a whole life.
You've done a lot more than me this morning, Robert, when it comes to an 1.5 hour hard bike ride. And I feel like I need to do some push-ups now, some sit-ups and things like that. Dr. Robert Enright, how can we stay in touch with you after this podcast show?
I would say visit our International Forgiveness Institute website, which is internationalforgiveness.com. Or email me. You can find me at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, just the directory, Robert Enright. And I will do my best, because I really have a passion for people understanding what forgiveness is, appropriating it if they want to, and then eventually leading the forgiving life.
I'm so grateful that you've spent so much time with us here on the Feel Good From Within podcast show. And I can't wait for us all to have more hope and more love and more positive virtues in our life. So thank you again.
You're quite welcome. And I also forgot, I am a blogger for a national magazine called Psychology Today. And the name of my blog is The Forgiving Life. And so these are shorter essays. So people might want to take a look at that as well, because there are 118 essays so far in there. And there might be something where they can get a quick read to get a sense before they go more deeply into forgiveness.
That sounds good. Bite-sized information, easy to read, Forgiving Life. I love the blog title as well as the book title. So thank you again.
You're quite welcome. It's my honor to be with you, Yvette.
I can't wait to have you back on the show. I seriously could talk to you for hours about this topic. I'm very passionate about it as well. We'll say goodbye to you now and wishing you all the best for your bike rides and your push-ups and your sit-ups and all of those good vibes. So thank you again.
You're quite welcome. Take care now. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening into this podcast episode. I hope you found this conversation of interest and of benefit to you. In support, I would love for you to subscribe to Feel Good From Within with Yvette Lee Blowitz on any podcast app or on YouTube or Rumble too. If you are listening to this on Apple Podcasts, I would also love for you to leave a 5-star rating and a review in support too. If you would like to donate to Feel Good From Within so I can create even more mental health podcast shows for you and everyone else to enjoy, you can by going to gofundme.com and just search for Feel Good From Within Mental Health Podcast Show. Be sure to share this show with your family, friends, and community, and to subscribe to my mailing list at YvetteLeeBlowitz.com, SpiritGirl.com, or FeelGoodFromWithin.com, and to follow Yvette Lee Blowitz, Spirit Girl, or Feel Good From Within on any social media app. And together, let's feel good from within.